Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. Of course, we're going to bring you the latest updates from Ukraine. In this episode, we're joined by Marina Miron, a war studies researcher in the Defense Studies Department at King's College of London. But before we do that, let's go ahead and dive deeper into the latest developments of the week.
A meeting between Pope Leo XIV and President Volodymyr Zelensky took place on May 18. During his inaugural Mass that day, the new pontiff said Ukraine was being martyred and called for a just and lasting peace. The push for peace talks comes most strongly from Washington. On Monday, Donald Trump spoke on the phone with Vladimir Putin. As hinted at by Vice President J.D. Vance, Moscow was offered an economic olive branch during the call.
The tone and the spirit of the conversation were excellent. Russia wants to do large-scale trade with the United States when this catastrophic bloodbath is over. And I agree. There is a tremendous opportunity for Russia to create massive amounts of jobs and wealth.
Despite this enthusiastic facade, according to the Wall Street Journal, Trump privately told European leaders that Putin isn't really interested in peace, something Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who was part of the conversation, didn't confirm nor deny.
I do not confirm that that statement was made, but I can confirm that the situation is difficult as there isn't a trace of goodwill from the Russian side.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was briefed on the 2-hour phone call with the Russian leader by Donald Trump himself and shared this comment on his social media.
If Putin puts forward unrealistic demands, this will mean that Russia will continue to drag out the war and deserves that Europe, America and the world act accordingly, including with further sanctions.
Speaking of sanctions, the EU has finally approved the 17th package. It targets vessels from Russia's shadow fleet, companies providing direct or indirect support to Russia's military, as well as individuals and entities responsible for violations of Ukraine's territorial integrity.
We welcome and we are thankful for adoption of the 17th package of sanctions. We need such strong steps now. We need to pressure Russia.
Before the end of the week, further measures were approved, this time against the imports of Russian and Belarusian fertilizers. A tariff hike from 6.5% to 100% is expected to take effect on June 1st.
We need to stop financing Russia's war in Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine!
On Friday, Russia and Ukraine began a major prisoners swap, which was previously negotiated in Istanbul. Despite all the efforts towards peace, Russia is ramping up attacks across Ukraine. On May 18, the largest drone attack since the beginning of the full-scale invasion was launched on Kyiv. One person was confirmed dead. Civilians were also killed or injured in multiple attacks on residential areas of Kherson.
The first strike was somewhere nearby. We realized it was serious and ran into the basement. The shells were coming so often, every minute or two. It was probably a tank.
Situation at the front lines remains tense. Russian forces are encircling the strategic towns of Pokrovsk and Constantinfka, most likely in preparation for a major summer offensive. But the hottest point on the map is currently the Sumy region, which borders Russia's recently reconquered Kursk Oblast. Daily attacks are intensifying. The Institute for the Study of War predicts that Putin's plan is to enter and annex the Sumy region. However, it seems unlikely that the plan would work. So far, Russia has been struggling to occupy any of Ukraine's bigger towns or cities.
And now joining us is Marina Miron, war studies researcher in the Defense Studies Department at King's College London. Thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine This Week. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me.
Yes, now I'd like to start off with a few political questions kind of out of the United States before we move on. In your view, what is the U.S. national interest in Ukraine, and do you think it's been misconstrued since the Trump administration has taken over?
Well, it's an interesting question because since the Trump administration took over, obviously the priorities have shifted. And if we look at the United States national security strategy, it outlines primary adversaries being China. Russia is not even on the top of the list, right? So this Ukraine conflict, according to Trump administration's reasoning, has been started by the Biden administration, even so we know that it goes back to 2014. And the seeds for the conflict were laid even earlier than that. So for Trump, it would be important to end the conflict, or at least to try. So he promised that he would end the conflict. He tried, but from his perspective, he is anti-globalist. So he is focusing more on America's national interest. And so he's looking at Ukraine as in, what can I get out of Ukraine? A lot of money has been spent on Ukraine with no tangible results. So in business speak, no returns on investment for Trump. And so he got a mineral deal in order to show that something is being gotten out of Ukraine. Whether it will be so is another matter, but it's a significant component of this. And as soon, if we look at the timeline, as soon as a deal had been signed, the Trump administration, after their call with the Kremlin, with Putin precisely, decide to step back from negotiations. So in other words, now Trump's hands are untied to resolve other issues, because inside the United States, there are issues. There are issues with China. There are issues with Iran. There are issues with North Korea. So the United States has a lot of these adversaries, has a lot of ambitions, and also wants to become somewhat self-sufficient. This is why we're seeing this trade war. And so Ukraine and Israel, to a certain extent, they have been, let's say, requiring resources which the administration doesn't have or wants to use elsewhere. And so now Trump can say, I tried several times, or my administration tried, it didn't work out. Let the two parties handle it by themselves. And he walks away from that without losing face. And nobody can say he hasn't tried. Yes, of course, he has tried as a politician. And so he has created a very elegant, shall we say, exit for himself, leaving it all to Europe to handle Ukraine or to support Ukraine, with the US distancing itself and saying, well, now we're going to focus on other issues, other priorities, which are more important than Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but they haven't given up completely, at least not yet. And I mean, Trump has never spoken on preserving the territorial integrity and defending the international rules-based order. Just recently, during these hearings in Congress, Marco Rubio refused to call Vladimir Putin a war criminal. Now, do you think that this is still the continuation of the strategy to try and woo Vladimir Putin and get him to the table by not talking, talking trash about Russia and Vladimir Putin?
Well, I look at it from a realist perspective, and the national interest trumps here. So calling Vladimir Putin names wouldn't necessarily add to anything. And if the United States, as we have seen with the new sanctions package, is not going to participate in those secondary sanctions, they most likely want to reestablish trade relations with Russia. And this would benefit the United States. So if we look at what the US does from a foreign policy angle, wherever the United States benefits, it doesn't matter which country it is, it will establish some sort of bilateral relations or cut relations if it is to the US detriment. Mm-hmm. And this is a guiding line for what the Trump administration has been doing. We also know that in the Senate, Lindsey Graham is trying to get the sanctions package approved. However, we don't know whether this internal turmoil within the administration, how successful it will be. But we see from the very top, namely President, he's not as aggressive towards Russia even as, say, Marco Rubio. And so we see this tension a little bit like a good cop, bad cop. And we also see a lot of controversial statements by Trump himself if we follow his Truth Social. Sometimes he is more negative towards Russia. Sometimes he's more positive towards Russia. But I'd say his negativity towards Ukraine has outweighed his negativity towards Russia. And I believe that probably the interest calculation from the Trump administration is that Russia can be a useful ally in certain situations, such as when it comes to a confrontation with China, when it comes to regulating relations with Iran or controlling Iran or Iran's uranium enrichment, or perhaps with North Korea. And also we have the Arctic region. So there are a lot of topics that the Trump administration could be discussing with the Kremlin, which don't concern Ukraine. Now, if we look at Ukraine, what could Ukraine possibly offer Trump from his perspective? Well, possibly the minerals, but what else? Ukraine doesn't have that political capital. And therefore, for the Trump administration, it is more interesting to work with Russia. And here it's a purely selfish interest. Russia has more to offer. We don't have a moral or ethical compass that the Europeans have. We have an interest, and we're going to pursue that interest.
Well, unfortunately, it does certainly seem like that is the case. Now, moving on, though, Senator Rubio stated that the court challenging Ukraine is, quote, Russia wants what they do not currently have and are not entitled to, and Ukraine wants what they cannot regain militarily. Now, do you agree with this assessment that that Ukraine cannot retake its territory in a military solution?
Well, it's a difficult one because it depends on time. How many generations will it take for Ukraine to retake the territories? It is a very problematic matter. And we see that Ukraine needs outside support. And I'm not just talking about military equipment. I'm also talking about economic aid, financial aid, because the Ukrainian economy has to be able to afford to pay the people that are being recruited to join the military, for instance, to outfit them. And so you have a very difficult situation now, because I would say in a regular style warfare on same conditions, Ukraine doesn't have the chance to retake those territories simply because Russia has more manpower. And as we have seen, European allies do want to support Ukraine in rhetoric, but often the support comes very late or not in numbers promised. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the other way to win this war for Ukraine is to break Russia's will. And that requires a completely different approach. If we look at irregular warfare from the past century, such as decolonization, or even if we look at Afghanistan this century, and you wonder how is a technologically superior military can be defeated by quote-unquote ragtag militias, right? And this is the kind of warfare that I'm talking about that might bring about the strategic outcome that Ukraine is hoping for. But if the Russian armed forces are dictating the rules of the game, then I think the prospects are very poor, just for the number of reasons I outlined just now, as well as constant support. Ukraine can innovate. Ukraine has great engineers, but it doesn't have the capacity to outproduce Russia. And neither do the Europeans, who are now preparing for a war with Russia. And for me, it seems a little bit odd because when European politicians are talking about Russia attacking the Baltic states, it seems to me like they're already saying, well, Ukraine is lost. Now we need to prepare because we will be next.
Right. So essentially what you're saying is that the change from Russia or potential, I guess, retaking of Ukrainian territory would have to be facilitated by, say, the collapse of Russia from within, whether it be severe economic pressure or maybe social pressure, which still seems not to be cracking. So therefore, what can the West do to ensure that Russia fails at home so it's unable to project power abroad?
Well, it's not exactly what I was implying. It doesn't necessitate a collapse from within. Again, going back to the example of Afghanistan, the US didn't collapse from within, but it still withdrew from Afghanistan, meaning that the Ukrainian side would have to break the will of the Russian armed forces to continue fighting in Ukraine.
Okay.
And that requires a completely different approach and probably not so drastic as to try to collapse Russia from within, because Russia is a securitized state, and the Russians are very much aware of the methods that can be used within Russia in order to bring about such a collapse, or at least to attempt such a collapse. And there is a rich experience with the Soviet Union, how Stalin handled opposition. There were, whenever there were any sort of rumors about a potential opposition, I'm not even talking about armed rebellion, those people would be resettled in mass. They would simply disappear, and everybody connected to that person who would probably voice the idea would also disappear. It's a huge logistical effort. So I'm sure that it will be a very difficult task. And to achieve that, European intelligence services would have to get very aggressive. And I don't think that it's something that the Europeans are going to do. And now we have also seen a couple of months ago, I think 1.5 months ago, Trump has ordered his intelligence services to stop cyber attacks within Russia. Right? So It is to assume that the United States is not going to participate in this venture. What I'm talking about is rather exhausting the Russian forces on the battlefield, basically switching to guerrilla-style warfare, because that can indeed lead to exhaustion. So try to exhaust the kind of the military part, which would then create pressure on the political leadership. And of course, these kind of wars are lengthy. If we look at history, they can go on for 20, 30 years. But at the end of the day, you get where you want to get, but it's time costly, and it requires a lot of resilience. It requires perhaps less resources than your opponent, but we have seen, for instance, some of these tactics being used, like using cheap drones to destroy very expensive equipment.
Right.
That would be one way, or a good example of how this asymmetrical approach works. And that is how you wear down your adversary morally, because you cannot protect everything.
Yeah. Well, Ukraine recently fired hundreds of attack drones at Russia, and one of the largest attacks in more than 3 years of war. In total, 10 Russian regions were targeted in a barrage of that lasted some 36 hours, including a drone strike on semiconductor plant in Russia's Oryol region, which targeted a key supplier of microelectronics for Iskander and Kinzhal missiles, as well as fighter jets. Now, these types of strikes, I mean, obviously we saw the biggest one, but we've seen a lot of these strikes, working on oil refineries, taking out other strategic locations for Russia's military production. How productive have these been, or how conducive have these attacks been in trying to cripple the Russian military and the Russian war machine?
Well, I think it's too early to judge that, because I think the effect will be seen afterwards, because Russia has also created a stockpile of Iskander missiles, of Kinzhal missiles, meaning that we will not see a drop in attacks in order to establish whether these attacks have been successful. I think the biggest success would be psychological, of course, as to show that the Kremlin cannot protect its critical infrastructure. And so this is more of fear-inducing. And I do think that materially, yes, these attacks will create some damage. For instance, when it comes to microelectronics, Russia has a huge problem with those, especially semiconductors. And therefore, depending on how many factories for semiconductors Russia has, that could, at least in the short term, create a bottleneck when it comes to production. However, as I said, Ukraine would need many more drones in order to be able to completely destroy, maybe it's not even possible, or even long range missiles to actually cripple the Russian war machine. Because yes, drones can do some damage, they have a certain amount of reach, but as I said, in itself it's not going to be sufficient.
Yeah.
It has to be a part of a larger strategy.
Okay, well, moving on. Putin recently visited the Kursk region after the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces and he spoke about creating a buffer zone with the aim of annexing Sumy Oblast, potentially seizing the city of Sumy as well. Also considering during last talks in Istanbul, the Russian delegation explicitly threatened to take the oblast to establish the so-called buffer zone. Given the contested control over several border villages, how serious do you think that this, of a threat do you think that this is? And does Russia currently have the capability to launch a full-scale offensive in the Sumy region?
That's a good question. I mean, we also have to separate rhetoric, political rhetoric, from reality. It could be a way to mislead as well in terms of where the expected summer offensive. So it's been in the Ukrainian media, also in the Russian media, the expected summer offensive, that the Russian forces are preparing a summer offensive, and we don't know where it's going to be. We need to look at the map and look at what's the most logical and achievable thing. I think that creating a buffer zone right now as it stands is going to be a very difficult undertaking. Ukrainian forces are resisting, they're fighting, and they're not making it easy for the Russians. Even if you listen to the Russian side, how they report about the fierce battles that they are facing with the Ukrainian forces around some key locations. Look at how long it takes to take Chasiv Yar for the Russians, just to give an example. And now imagine clearing the whole oblast, like Sumy Oblast, in order to secure the border. You know, logically, it kind of makes sense, right? But you need a lot of manpower because you need to clear it and you need to hold it. So you will have forces tied down there permanently in order to prevent the Ukrainian armed forces from retaking the territory. So a buffer zone essentially is a very manpower intensive undertaking and an expensive undertaking. So I don't think that at this stage this is going to happen.
It's not.
Maybe they will try to create a small buffer to ensure that the Ukrainian forces don't penetrate into Kursk region or Belgorod region. But I don't think that at this stage it's a viable option for the Russians, given the circumstances, given the fact that Russians have expenditures too, and they have manpower losses too, and quite colossal manpower losses. So, as I said before, maybe after some sort of a reduction in intensity of fighting is achieved, but I don't think that this will be the ultimate aim for the summer offensive.
We've seen what happened in Bakhmut. You just mentioned Chasiv Yar and how that's, well, they've kind of chewed pretty much through the city. They're on getting to the outskirts. We've seen Avdiivka, and now it looks like Constantinfka with, with the salient kind of going to the south, coming out of Pokrovsk and encroaching up in that area. What are the possibilities that Constantinfka could be in danger of being captured over this summer?
There is a real possibility if the Russian forces make it a priority. I know that they have been trying to get to Constantinivka for quite a while now. And as you see on the battlefield, it's not that simple. You think, oh, well, it's just a village, right? But you have to you have to look at the front line and how they are trying to straighten the front line to prevent the Ukrainian forces from outflanking the Russian forces. So, as far as Constantinivka is concerned, yes, there is a possibility that it will be Constantinivka that will fall. There is a possibility that Kupiansk will fall. So we really don't know where they will accelerate their operational tempo, because my guess is at some point they will want to get to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. And so for that reason, they would need to focus their forces on that direction. They might go for Zaporizhia. We don't know. So the possibilities are there. Zaporizhia is another very attractive option. We know that Russian reconnaissance sabotage groups have been entering Kherson, the Ukrainian-controlled Kherson, and so that could also be an option. The probability is, if we have to divide the probabilities equally depending on what direction they will see as the most sensible for them to focus on.
Yeah, we just saw this attack on a small settlement in Zaporizhia. It seems like on the border there of Zaporizhia, Kherson regions. What do attempts like that, does that signify that Russia wants to push in that direction, do you think? If you know the one that I'm referring to?
Yeah, well, it could mean that they are shaping the battlefield. It could mean that they are trying to distract the Ukrainian armed forces. The whole idea is not to maintain the initiative of surprise. For instance, the big mistake by Western media was to announce a Ukrainian counteroffensive. And so the Russians had enough time to prepare, because it's been announced for maybe 6 months with discussions of all possible directions the Ukrainian forces could go to. And this is something that the Russians essentially don't want, is to show their hand where they will be attacking. They will try to amass troops, to send stormtroopers and to send troops to hold the location, whichever location it will be. But the trick here in this war, where you have a lot of surveillance, specifically from the Ukrainian side, which is still getting satellite information from the Americans, and FPV drones, it's very difficult to hide your intentions. So that might have been just a way to divert attention, maybe to lure Ukrainian forces from another location and have them think, oh, well, maybe the Russians are attacking there, so we'll redeploy our forces to that location and the Russians attack somewhere else. So this is more kind of operational, tactical level, I would say.
Okay. In the first 4 months of 2025, Russia captured about 1,000 kilometers, or 0.17% of Ukrainian territory, but suffered approximately 180,000 casualties. How long is this sustainable for Russia?
I think, well, first of all, I don't trust any statistics, neither those coming from the Kremlin, nor Kyiv, nor the West, because realistically, it's very difficult to estimate when it comes to losses. That being said, I agree that the losses for the Russians have been very high, both in personnel and equipment. And given the situation, and given the fact that a lot of people projected Russia to crumble back in 2022 when sanctions have been introduced, and we're seeing now we're in spring, end of spring 2025, and we're seeing that the Russians don't have that same problem with manpower that they had at the very beginning. As Valery Zaluzhny recently stated at a London Defense Conference, the Ukrainians are now being outplayed in terms of technology. So it seems that the Russians have caught up in terms of technology. Also depends on what area of technology you're talking about.
Right.
And the fact that there are these slow but steady gains by the Russian armed forces, it would suggest that the Russians do have quite a stamina when it comes to this war. And unfortunately, as I said, at the very beginning of the war, one would say Russia doesn't have the time. But I would argue that Putin is indeed holding the clock. Unless something happens like the Black Swan effect, something happens to Putin, there is a new leader in Russia who is completely West friendly, which would be a complete turn down. I think that we have to be realistic to realize that Russia has more capabilities and more manpower than Ukraine does. And in this context, it's important to mention the Europeans also and the European defense capabilities, especially with the current rift with the United States. That makes it very disconcerting because I'm not sure how much the Europeans can support Ukraine and for how long, despite the positive rhetoric of, we'll stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. But that as long as it takes has never been defined. No clear goal has ever been defined. And we have seen Ukraine left in the cold quite a few times by the Europeans because they couldn't deliver XYZ, or they delivered faulty equipment, or equipment was sent too late. So it's not, even if the goodwill is there, I would say it's not 100% reliable partner. And if you read squarely through Ukrainian media, Ukrainians realize that. And they say, well, it's better to count on ourselves than to count on somebody, because you never know how it's going to go.
Certainly. And, based on the current trajectory of what we're seeing both politically and on the battlefield in Ukraine, what is your outlook for this year? What does this year have in store for Ukraine?
It's a difficult one because it depends on many factors. So I like to take a mathematical approach and say, well, what is the highest probability of XYZ? So I see the Russians probably going for a summer offensive. Depending on the outcome of that offensive, I think parallel to the offensive, the Ukrainian and the Russian side might be holding another round of talks, maybe in Istanbul. I doubt it's going to be the Vatican City. And I think there will be pressure exerted upon Ukraine from both military angle and political angle to reach some sort of an agreement. We also have to understand that for Ukraine, also the internal situation, war is very difficult on the Ukrainian society, and it's polarizing the Ukrainian society. So I'm also worried that this instability might lead to fissures also within the Ukrainian military. So depending on the outcome of the Russian offensive and the ability of the Ukrainian forces to stop this offensive and to maintain as many territories as they can, I think that will be a determining factor in future rounds of negotiations between both sides, and perhaps in demands. But I as long as Ukraine has manpower to fight, I don't think that the Ukrainian side will agree to Russia's conditions as they stand. Now we have another option, is the change of political leadership. And again, that will depend on what kind of political leadership Ukraine will have, and whether that political leadership will be more willing to work with Russia and remain in Russia's sphere of influence as opposed to the West. So that is a third scenario, which adds kind of a complexity. I'm trying to do this in very, very simple terms. Either way, I don't think it is very likely that the war will end unless there is a complete military defeat on the battlefield or a change of political leadership in Ukraine to somebody who is pro-Russian.
Marina Miron, War Studies researcher in the Defense Studies Department at King's College in London. Thank you so much for your analysis. We very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for all the latest developments from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you then. Goodbye.